So every episode of Wandavision references a different sitcom. The first episode is a direct reference to the Dick Van Dyke Show, the second is a reference to Bewitched, etc., etc. But if you're anything like me, then you don't give a shit about any of that, and you just want to know if the show is good. So, is Wandavision good? Well, according to my calculations, most people will get bored of Wandavision after the first episode, in the same way that most people will get bored of this video in about 30 seconds. So let's get down to brass tacks. The fourth episode of Wandavision just came out, and the writing is...
So you can't reach anyone inside, and everyone on the outside has some sort of selective amnesia.
Well...
I know Sword's your home. Your mom built this place from the ground up. You grew up here.
Abysmal. I mean, I know Marvel has never been revered for their dialogue writing chops. Usually the exposition is serviceable at best, but I was really taken aback by how cheesy this episode was.
That means whatever the threat is, Sword clearly has no idea what they're dealing with.
I guess if their goal was to pay homage to modern-day procedural shows, then they nailed it. It really does feel like an episode of NCIS or CSI Miami, or worst of all, it feels like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And speaking of that show, the events of this episode serve the same purpose as Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. They attempt to add an extra layer of dimension to the cataclysmic events that take place in the MCU. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. attempted to show the consequences of the first several MCU films, and eventually just went down a weird hole of obscure Marvel characters. Honestly, I lost interest after a few seasons, and I'm not entirely sure where the show ended up. This show, or at least this episode, is attempting to show the consequences of the final battle in Avengers Endgame. And how could they not? They had no choice but to show something like this, but the problem is the endless barrage of expository dialogue that fills up the first 5 minutes. There's no time to breathe until like the 7th minute of the episode. Contrast this with the opening scene of Avengers Endgame, which spends several minutes with Hawkeye enjoying time with his family before they mysteriously disappear. Now, this scene was predictable when I saw it in the theaters. Obviously, seeing Hawkeye meant that something bad was about to happen. I think we all knew what this scene was as soon as it started, but it was tastefully done, and I actually felt something. Meanwhile, in WandaVision Episode 4, I don't even have time to feel anything. It's like when they kill off the parents in a Disney movie. You almost never feel any sympathy for the death because they rush past it. Well, almost never. So we're left with an opening scene that does nothing but establish this character's relationship to her mother, and then we're quickly rushed into a scene explaining her presence in the Sword organization. I mean, points for brevity, I guess. I'm definitely glad we didn't spend too long on this character, because eventually the main characters of this episode turn out to be Kat Dennings and Randall Park, and even though their dialogue is at the absolute USDA-mandated limit for corn product, they at least are entertaining to watch on screen. Maybe it was intentional for the writing to be as corny and self-aware as contemporary procedural shows, but then that really puts a dent in the theming of the show. The idea that the sitcom universe that Wanda lives in is some sort of constructed idea of normality that is in fact anything but normal. I mean, if we're supposed to retroactively understand that the reason Wanda used sitcoms as her escapism was to avoid dealing with reality, which is very clearly what they're building to, then the show outside of the sitcom, the real world of Kat Dennings and Randall Park, should be a little more grounded and not hang so many lampshades on everything. We should be able to separate the style of the episodes within the sitcom and the world outside the sitcom. And while yes, these two episodes are definitely stylistically very different, they both engage in a heightened reality that makes them both feel like homages to television, just from two totally different eras. Whereas if the show really wants to work with its theming, the early episodes should feel fantastical and the fourth episode should feel grounded. So let's look at a couple things from the fourth episode before we go back and talk about the other episodes. Two scenes in the episode see somebody from Sword crawling through a sewer to emerge in the middle of town, which we saw at the end of episode 2. But this only serves one purpose, to explain why we saw the beekeeper. This scene doesn't present us with any new information about the town or about the person emerging from the sewer, so why did we watch these scenes for an entire 3 minutes? We could have assumed that the beekeeper in episode 2 was from Sword just from watching this episode. And we didn't need to see him crawl through the sewer. It doesn't really present us with new information. It's really just filler. Now, the best scene, or worst, depending on your perspective, is when Randall Park and Kat Dennings literally go frame by frame through the first episode of WandaVision and identify every single person in the sitcom. Now, the reason I say best or worst is because this is either a brilliant parody of the Marvel fanboys in real life who analyze every moment of every film and trailer, identifying characters and making lame clickbait articles about which comic books are being referenced by which films, or it's an unintentional window into the way these movies and shows are actually written, where the writers of the show are the Marvel fanboys, trying to cram as many Easter eggs as possible into their work so they can get credit from nerds on the internet. I mean, we literally watch these two characters do the exact same thing that fanboys on YouTube do whenever a new trailer drops for an Avengers film. It's pretty great. Intentional parody or not, I still laughed. There's another handful of self-aware moments in the episode, like when Randall Park speculates that the production design is the reason for the helicopter changing appearance. It's a cute meta moment, I guess. This is the first episode in the series that actually tries to be self-aware in any way, with Kat Dennings noting the sexist content of the show they're watching, and, a bunch of other quick one-liners. But I think now is a little late to be self-aware in a show like this, and they really go overboard with it. I mean, it is just self-referential to the point of absurdity. Earlier episodes of the show lack any self-awareness, which I suppose was by design, but doesn't really work for me personally. If you're going to use a premise in which you're not just homaging, but straight up beat for beat imitating the style of old sitcoms, you really should wink at the audience once in a while to confirm that the writers are aware of the cheesiness of the premise. They are definitely aware, but they don't let you in on the joke until the 4th episode, which works for certain premises, just not this one. It's pretty clear that the show is using its premise in exactly the way I expected. The sitcom nature of the episodes is meant to present a familiarity, something that seems normal, so that the protagonist can be taught a lesson about living in a fantasy defined by normality, blah blah blah. Sitcoms presented a view of suburban life that was free of true struggles, where the day-to-day conflicts of cooking and cleaning and magic shows and doctor visits were the only things that actually mattered. Sitcoms avoided showing true pain and true suffering, and as such pretended that they never existed. The only trick this show has up its sleeve is a protagonist who is pretending that everything is normal, and her fantasy manifests as a sitcom neighborhood with a sitcom lifestyle so she can avoid her suffering. And then at the end, she'll learn her lesson, it'll be a little emotional, but it will be predictable and honestly not that innovative for 2021. A lot of clever things could be done with a premise like this, but this show just wastes its potential. It's not just a wasted opportunity, it actually feels like it makes the whole show pointless. Why did you deliberately engage in an outdated format only to worship its strengths and ignore its weaknesses? Why not take the opportunity to criticize some aspects of the golden age of television? The show doesn't seem very opinionated about these old sitcoms. It isn't critical of them, it doesn't really praise them, it doesn't necessarily play off their strengths, it doesn't utilize their weaknesses in any interesting ways. It's just a bunch of recycled ideas in a very vanilla package, totally safe and unassuming. If I was going to create a show that uses sitcom tropes in order to create a normality that will later be subverted, I would at least want to be critical of the worst aspects of old sitcoms. The lack of continuity, the unrealistic pace at which conflicts are resolved, the necessity for normalcy to be maintained at all costs, the upholdance of oppressive cultural values, praise for conformity. At least let Wanda think to herself for a second that maybe she doesn't want to please everybody in town and fit in. We're kind of talking about the show as a whole now, but I guess we should try to go back to the first 3 episodes and talk about those for a second. Do I think the first 3 episodes are good? I think they're okay. I could say some very positive things about the production design and special effects, but I won't. I could also say some negative things about the writing, and, I feel like we've touched on that a little bit, and maybe we'll get to some more later. But I wanted to take a closer look at the show's use of historic sitcom formulas and decide whether or not it uses them with any merit. As we already discussed, it seems like the answer is probably no. See, the internet is a place designed for nerds who only watch TV in their spare time to sit and pick apart every Easter egg, reference, and every clever little thing you probably didn't spot the first time you watched it. Then they can compile it into an article or a video that you'll skim through and feel like you learned something about comic books, or feel smart for having already known that thing. The articles and videos for Wandavision are already popping up despite only a handful of episodes being released so far. If you're looking for someone to explain why Wanda wearing pants is significant, or to point out that Vision's tie features a symbol from some comic book, those videos are out there for you. If one of those nerds came to this video, they'd probably feel inclined to explain to me how the references from these old sitcoms are actually very smart and clever, but I'm not convinced. Homaging older works doesn't necessarily mean you have to incorporate the same tired old tropes into your script, and the 4th episode where the writers hang a lampshade on everything from the first 3 episodes doesn't make it any better. I'm just surprised at how safe the show feels. Like it's not actually putting a twist on any formula. When I saw the trailer, this is pretty much exactly the show I expected it to be. A formula-driven sitcom with a mystery as to the nature of the premise. Now that we know what they're doing with the premise and how unclever it is, I'm just very disappointed. However, as safe as the show feels, it does do one thing that surprised me. I was very shocked to see the first 3 episodes eagerly engage in the misogynistic standards and sexist humor of the shows which they're homaging, and don't address them in any way. Not counting the 4th episode when Kat Dennings makes one comment about washing dishes, the show makes no attempt to subvert or make interesting use of the sexism from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In the 3rd episode, the doctor has a line about how women have trouble understanding medical and biological concepts, and Wanda and Vision just look at him like, okay, yeah, makes sense. I mean, what was that? And the overwhelmingly white cast does make the show feel like a real sitcom from the golden age of television, but not in a good way. You've got one token black neighbor, you've got Geraldine, and then everyone else is just white. And it's not like they're making clever commentary on the racial makeup of TV shows from the past. They're just only casting white people. It seems a little strange for the people at Disney who are constantly pushing for diversity and everything, but then they turn around and cast a show like this with only white people. I mean, it's in line with the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I guess, but it just seems like, I don't know, I would have cast this show very differently. That's just me. Anyway, I think it's pretty obvious where the show is going, but if I turn out to be wrong, I'll make an apology video, and I'll donate like $20 to a Disney charity or something. Speaking of Disney being an awful company that's desperate for your money, did you know that I'm making a cartoon about how awful Disney is? It should be released on YouTube later this year, but you can go see a preview right now on Patreon. You can go over there and check out what it's about, but if you want to help us out without giving us money, we'd really appreciate it if you shared this video, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to us to help out our engagement numbers. We really love making videos and cartoons and want to be able to spend more time doing it, but the only way that we can do that is with your help. If you want to keep hearing me complain about Disney and their products, why not subscribe so you know when my next video is released? After all, how am I going to be able to afford to keep watching these episodes without a little YouTube ad revenue? Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned until next time when I talk about... What's coming up next? What can I talk about?